Hello, everyone. This is Mr. Abiunis. I am the other world history teacher for those people who are students of Mist Breen. Today, we will be talking about the Americas. I guess a quick side note before we get going. Our first two units we set up for you guys. First one was centered on the Silk Road, and your current unit, the one that you guys are working on right now, is roughly based on trade routes that are centered around Africa. And then one problem we have when we're trying to do this system, of course, is that we had these American civilizations. And of course, one of the big characteristics that we'll talk about here is that they didn't have trade routes connecting with the rest of the world because, like I said, Africa and Eurasia did not know the Americas existed until, the 1500s. So this is kind of the oddball one of the unit that you should still definitely know, but unfortunately, the way we try to organize things, it didn't quite fit into our trade routes. All right, so we're going to talk about four civilizations today. The first one we're going to talk about is the Mayans. So hopefully, especially World One guys, you guys know a little bit about these civilizations we're going to talk about. But I'm just going to go a little bit more in depth with them, and also, try to break this down, especially by themes for our world history. Remember, we use pieces. So the Mayans were started in about 150 BCE and made it to 900 CE. I'll give you a rough translation. It said Roman Empire was happening about the same time, and also the Han Dynasty was around the same time as well. Unfortunately, we don't really know a lot about the Mayans because we don't really know their language. So a lot of what we talk about today is just based on the cities that we find that they left behind, and we're just trying to guessing from there. So we know that they had city-states. So remember, city-states are cities that also basically function as their own kind of country. They were a civilization as a whole, so they had actually multiple city-states going on at one time. But generally speaking, each city pretty much controlled itself. Rulers were mostly men. However, I would say, if you see a little side note right there, women could rule if the ruler died and there was no actual male heirs available. And you see right here, this is going to be a trend also for the just for the Aztecs as well and Incas, is that a lot of these rulers would one of the courses of their causes of their authority is the fact that they claim that they were descended from gods. And the main way that maybe larger city-states try to organize their territories is through a tribute system. And a tribute system I'm going to mention multiple times today. So think about the Han Dynasty especially, and then Chinese and maybe the Song Dynasty more recently. Their empires were ruled by a central government that was really hands-on and trying to control its local elites. But with the tribute system, that's not what happens. Basically, you have a big city, and as long as it's smaller cities paid money in tribute, or in the case of the Mayans and Aztecs, also humans as well, pretty much the local smaller cities can just pretty much do what they wanted. And one thing I want to point out, if you're looking at their cities, they are very organized. So that suggests, although we don't really know too much about them, is that they did have an organized government that did a very good job. It's really, really hard to make a grid-like system. And just to say, one of the things you want to do in world history is try to connect things from previous civilizations. So this reminds me of Mohenjo-Daro, which is one of those river valley civilizations we talked about in our foundations unit all the way back when. So yeah, very, very organized. Therefore, it must have a pretty good government. Again, we don't really know too much about this government, unfortunately, because unfortunately a lot of that history has been lost. And if you think about it too, these cities were fairly large, which also means that if you all those people living there have to be fed. So they must have had also a pretty good system of transporting food to these cities. All right, next up we got innovations. And the first thing you think of for innovations in the Mayans, they have their calendar and they have astronomy. So these things were very, very accurate. You could actually they could predict solar eclipses ahead of time. And they said they could still even be used up until even a few years ago, I believe, in some of these. They also came up with the concept of zero, which if you remember actually started in India and then eventually made its way up through trade routes to things like Europe. So this is independent of India, but it also shows one of the, I guess, the cliches when we talk about these American civilizations is that they are somehow inferior to Western civilizations. But I'm hoping as I'm talking through today, you start getting understanding that they actually were pretty sophisticated. And to call them inferior, what would I guess to argue again is the Eurocentric view of history and trying to basically plot ahead to when Europeans eventually do take over these civilizations in 1500. All right, environment, I already kind of mentioned they must have had a pretty well organized environmental system to be able to help build these cities up. Their main crops that they grew, you got corn, beans, and squash. One of the things we'll talk about in future units, probably 2 or 3 from now, is the fact that the Americas actually had a bunch of food that we probably take for granted today. And it's only when the Europeans actually discovered the Americas and started trading with the Americas that these like foods such as like even tomatoes and potatoes you can add on here as well and chocolate actually started going to Eurasia. And remember, they're doing all this thing, no beast of burden. That means this is all man-made. They don't have horses to help loosen up the field. They don't have cattle. It is all done by humans. This is an extensive work. Culture, big thing you need to know is all these civilizations, including the Mayans, they are polytheistic. And one of the things you want to do when you look at gods, when you're trying to, or probably like analyze a civilization, is try to figure out, who are their main gods and then why are they the main gods. In this case, you can see the main gods, corn, rain, and sun. So that probably tells you something about what they valued as the most important thing in their society. Rain and corn, that's things you can sun, all those things you need for an agricultural society for your main crop of food. And of course, the other thing we'll mention, which is also tied to religion, is they did practice human sacrifices. And of course, most of you guys probably think of human sacrifices with the Aztecs, and they certainly did it as well. On the side, you see pictured is a book that I actually read this past summer when Montezuma met Cortez. Montezuma is actually the Aztec emperor when Cortez, the European, originally showed up. And one of the things that this book argues is human sacrifice, although it did happen, a lot of traditional history tends to overemphasize it. It was bloody and gory. They did result in tearing people's hearts out. But that being said, we don't really know a clear form of how many human sacrifices actually did happen. And like I said, a lot of times when these descriptions that we have today are from Europeans watching it and perhaps even over dramatizing it as a nice way to try to treat these civilizations as others, hence therefore inferior. Hence, it was okay that we Europeans actually invaded them. So, you can, I just want to keep that in the back of your head. Again, so these are sophisticated civilizations, but again, don't downplay them. Next up, we got E for economics, another E. There's very little trade that actually did happen between these civilizations. There was some small-scale trade, but nothing too large like in Eurasia when we had the Silk Road, or eventually you guys are talking about or have talked about the Trans-Sahara trade route and the maritime trade route in the Indian Ocean. And there's a theory by a guy named Jared Diamond, and he basically said it's much easier to trade along latitudes because latitudes have a similar environment, therefore it's much easier to move because it's a similar environment. Whereas with longitude, you can go, you can get colder and hotter, and it's much, more difficult to sustain long distance trade. And one of the big themes that I keep talking about, trade equals not only the spread of goods, but also the spread of ideas. And that was one disadvantage for a lot of these American civilizations. Now, again, you don't have to necessarily buy this theory. I don't know if I 100% buy it myself, but it is a very prevalent theory that is out there that you should know and feel free to use on things like your essays. And the last one we got for the Mayan civilization is social for social. And if you look at there, I just put a picture of a pyramid on there. This type of pyramid is something you probably have seen a lot. You always have the priests and nobles at the top, and then you have a lot of people at the bottom, the peasants and artisans who are the ones actually growing the food. So like I said, a lot of these agricultural societies, only a few people actually remain. And now again, we don't actually have written records of these Mayans, so we don't actually exactly know how this social system worked. That being said, When we look at these cities, there are definitely some small sections where there's really large and elaborate houses, and then there's the very large section with very small dwellings. Which, based on that, we can kind of get a sense of get an idea of how society looked like. And then our next civilization we're going to talk about is the Chahoka civilization, which is one of our Mississippi River civilizations, the mound builders. Some of you guys probably have not heard about this one. This one's not in World History 1. But we wanted to make sure we mention this one just so you know there were civilizations in North America as well. And this is just the one that we chose to describe for. So here's an example of a mound that's still around today. So you can go around and see these big raised mounds. And they didn't just happen by coincidence. These were made by humans. And you can see how in the picture, inside of these mounds, there are structures as well. So again, these are sophisticated, organized societies that even though they are gone today, and quite frankly, we don't know too much about them because European conquest and whatnot, we should still respect them, and they are not inferior civilizations. All right, so quick overview of this one, 700 to about 1500. The 1500 is very, very vague because, again, we don't really have precise dates on these. That being said, we can make some few guesses based on what we found in these civilizations. They did have an extensive trade network, and we know that because when we're doing archaeology in these sites, we have found bear teeth from all the way in the Rocky Mountains, and we've also found turtle shells that go all the way down from the Gulf of Mexico. So although I just said earlier, that's why I don't really necessarily buy that theory too much, they did definitely trade from fairly far away places. Their religion was animism, which is just a nice way to say they believed in the natural world that was filled with spirits, and especially hunters would try to respect a lot of the animal spirits out there. Social class system, very, very similar to what I just talked about. You have a few priests/nobles at the top, but then most people are, commoners who are like farmers, hunters, artisans at the, it makes up that main part of the bottom. And I said social coolness here. So most of our civilizations that we talk about have patriarchy. So remember, men are number one, women tend to be number two. But that is not the case in this civilization. They live in a matrilineal society, which basically means property and titles, family social status, is actually passed to women and not actually the sons in this society. So he said most societies, it's not this way, but we get a little coolness on this one. Where it actually goes through the women. For collapse, we don't really know how the civilization collapsed. Kind of similar, I didn't actually mention this, but we don't really know how the mines collapsed either. The best guesses we can say is maybe environment kind of caused it. Maybe their population grew too big to the point where they couldn't actually support their large population. Or maybe climate change happened and they weren't able to adjust to that climate change enough. The other theory that we have here is maybe European diseases. So a lot of times diseases from Europeans, the most common one that we always talk about is smallpox, can spread out ahead of time from person to person before Europeans even set foot in the area. And basically massively reduces that population. There's a lot of reports of Europeans who would visit a lot of these cities in the 1500s and then remark about how large the population is. And then maybe like 20 years later or 30 years later, another European would walk by that same location and note the fact that it was much more sparse than it was before. And so, again, we don't really know too much about the collapse. We just have those theories. Those are the two most prevalent theories that we kind of base it off of. All right, our third civilization is the Aztecs. And just so you guys know, if you guys are reading about this or see it on the test, the Aztecs are also known as the Mexicas. So again, both I'm going to say Aztecs throughout this PowerPoint, but you could also see it by the other name as well. All right, so the Aztecs their history, they were supposedly up north and they migrated down into present-day Mexico. And in fact, Tenochtitlan, their capital city, is where Mexico City is located today. I said their theory is, their myth of their story is that they were wandering around and they were waiting for a symbol from their gods about where they should actually settle. And when they saw an eagle holding a serpent in its beak sitting on a cactus, that was the sign that this is the spot where they're actually going to build their city. And one of the things about the Aztecs, which we'll talk about a little bit later on, these guys, they came here. They were very, very warlike. So looking at Tenochtitlan, the city they eventually build, you can see it's actually in the middle of a lake. It started out as a small island that then they expanded upon. So again, technological skills to be able to scoop up dirt from the bottom of the lake and then be able to settle it on the island and make it last so they can actually build cities on the city on top of it. And also, if you're looking at the picture of the city, you notice once again, it is very grid-like and also has thoroughfares. So this form of government, again, is very well organized. And this city in particular supported 200,000 people. At least that's how much we got estimated wise. And Cortez, the guy who I mentioned a little bit earlier, who comes to this city, he's initially, when he sees it, he is amazed because this city is actually larger than most cities in Europe. It's also the largest city in the Americas during this time. So like I said, when you look at this though, this is a huge city and that requires lots and lots of organizational skills, even food-wise, to be able to even manage this. All right, and here's just a quick picture showing you that lake once again. You can see one of the things that the Aztecs are known for making are chinapas, which is where they make those artificial islands that I was mentioning earlier for their cities, and they could actually make those artificial islands to grow their food. And again, kind of like the Mayans, they have maize, which is another word basically for corn, and they also have squash and beans, the main ingredients they would make. So for government, you got an emperor at top. And his main job, again, they were very, very warlike, so they did a lot of war. They also, if you look on the third bullet point, they also were a theocracy, which is a fancy way to say they mixed their religion with their government. And like I said, there was human sacrifice that was involved in this as well. And kind of like with the Mayans as well, the Aztecs would rule over other civilizations themselves. So like I said, they started off, they migrated in here, and then eventually through war were able to get other city-states under their sphere. They didn't really do direct rule on those city-states. Again, they did the tribute system. So basically, other cities send them money and also humans for sacrifices. And generally speaking, the Aztecs will leave you alone. If you wanted another example of another civilization, this may sound familiar to you. If you remember the Golden Horde, the Mongols in Russia, they did the same thing, tribute system. So just give us money and we'll pretty much let you be as you are. That being said, and this is going to come back to haunt the Aztecs a little bit later in our history, those civilizations that you are getting tribute from, and in this case, even human sacrifices from, they don't necessarily like you. And eventually, that's going to backfire when Cortez shows up. He's actually massively outnumbered by the Aztecs. But Cortez is able to use those rivals of the Aztecs, so they don't really like them very much, to make a big army that is able to take them out. All right, religion you got is polytheistic, and again, as I mentioned before, they did human sacrifices, and like I said, I wish I could put like an asterisk next to those human sacrifices, because while that was a thing, and based on what we said, there are mass graves that say they definitely did it quite a bit, much more than the Aztecs did it. I don't want that to be the main point that you get out of the Aztecs. Just because I think there's a bit of Eurocentrism in there, where Europeans like to hype it up after the fact. And the other thing I'll mention really quick on this next slide before we move on from our Aztecs, just like with the Mayans, because they actually took the Mayan calendar as well. So again, these guys were mathematically sophisticated and actually had our 365-day agricultural calendar. All right, and the last civilization we're going to touch on today is the Incas. And remember, these Incas are located in South America. So we're moving further south. And the Incas were actually the last civilization to form of the ones we talked about. So the original Incas started at around 1100 CE, I guess I should really say. And they really hit their height around in the 15th century, which is kind of sad. That's the 1400s, for those who don't know what that means. That's about 100 years before Europeans start showing up. And if you look at this empire, it is actually a very, very large empire, which again speaks to the fact that for their government management, they had to be pretty good overall, especially when they're located in the Andes Mountains, which, again, you have to be pretty organized to move through mountains, especially when you don't have like horses to help communicate or anything. All communication in the Incas pretty much had to be done by humans on foot. One of the number one locations that people tend to talk about, and also one of the number one tourist traps that I really wish I could go to, maybe one day I'll be able to go to, is Machu Picchu. And again, you can see this is built in 1450, which is right before the Spanish conquest. And we don't 100% know what Machu Picchu is built for. We know it was probably built for an emperor, and it also had religious connotations to it as well. And one of the things when you're looking at this thing, we said the bricks, the stones were made very precisely so that they could fit each other to the point where there was no cracks. They didn't even need mortar to kind of build it together. And they're doing this way up high in the mountains. So imagine trying to lug these stones up really, really steep mountains. And it was all done by humans, not actually even done by any animals as well. So a lot of effort came to actually build this thing. After the conquest of the Incas, the Machu Picchu was forgotten about for a very, very long time, and only about I think like 150 years ago was it quote unquote discovered, or I should say rediscovered, uh, by historians. All right, government. You also have an emperor. So, emperors means that it started off with like one city state, and eventually they conquer other people as well. They're emperors. Their source of authority. They also say they're descendants from gods, and of course, the main god that they say that they're descended from is Inti, who's the sun god. And again, when you're thinking about religion and the gods that they worship, that kind of tells you what the most important thing in their culture. Sun is the source to be able to grow food. And also, we'll talk a little bit later. They also had a lot of gold, which they associated with Enki, the sun god. And one of the things about their government, just showing how good they are actually organization-wise, is the fact that they had a very, very long road system. And if you're looking at the picture in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see it's quite extensive, and especially all those zigzags going up that mountain. And they organized this road system through, I hope I say this right, the META system, which basically just means the citizens, at least once a year, would actually have to dedicate some of their time to help maintain the roads. So like today, your parents would pay taxes to our government, and that's how the government gets its due from you. For the Incans, their form of taxes was for every citizen, or every person, I should say, subject, to give their time to help maintain the road. All right, environment, as I mentioned, they're on the Andes Mountains, pretty steep. So one of the things that the Incans are known for is terrace farming. So they really cut ledges into their mountains to grow things. And just kind of like with the Aztecs, they have squash and beans and all that wonderful things. But you can also mention potatoes and corn and tomatoes as well. And one of the cool things that they're emperor did, their government would do, is in times of famine, they would make sure they had warehouses stocked up with food well in advance. So if a famine did come, the government could provide food throughout his whole entire empire. And as you saw in that previous slide, they had a lot of roads connecting all the empire together. So they were able to keep track of things and move things around. So yay, forward planning. For religion, as I mentioned before, they are polytheistic. And Inti is considered their most prevalent god, so you have a lot of symbology, especially centered around the sun. And as I mentioned earlier, they have gold, and they also, I didn't mention here, they also do have a lot of silver as well. And if you're looking ahead to when the Spanish eventually do conquer them in the 1500s, one of the things that the Incas will be forced to do is start mining for some these precious metals, so then it can go to Spain. And actually, to tell you the truth, a lot of that silver, because China has a bunch of the goods that Europeans actually want. So actually, a lot of those precious metals end up in China. And we can talk about what happens in China a little bit later, but let's just say the word inflation comes to mind. All right, and another cool thing about how you organize society, they didn't actually have a written language, which is quite impressive considering the fact that their empire was very extensive. But they did have a way of communicating, remember things, and that's through quipu, which is basically a series of strings and ropes, different colors and different knots. And based on how it's tied and different colors and whatnot, it had different, basically different meanings. And using this system, quipu, with all these ropes and knots, they were able to communicate with each other. And talking about the end, which we'll talk more about this later on. The Incas started collapsing actually before the Europeans actually arrived. And as I mentioned with those Mississippi Valley civilizations, maybe one of the reasons why is European diseases often went ahead of Europeans before the Europeans actually arrived with the army. And in fact, the current emperor, I'm not going to try to pronounce his name, he actually died right before Europeans actually came. Pizarro is the name of the guy who actually who gets credit for conquering the Incas. But Pizarro comes in when there's actually a civil war going on because of all this disease happening. So he takes advantage of the civil war to help him out. That being said, traditional history gives it to Pizarro as the one doing it. He does capture a large portion of the Incan Empire, but another portion of the Incan Empire actually survives for about another 40 years, just further inland in the mountains, before the Spanish are actually able to take it out. But again, that's a story for another unit. All right, guys, that is it for our American civilization. So you got 4 that you need to know. Like I said, it doesn't really fit too well in our unit when we're talking about African trade with Trans-Sahara and maritime, but you should know these civilizations and they are important, and we will get back to them a little bit later on. All right, thank you. Bye.